Hey guys, Stan Efferding here, founder of The Vertical Diet. We provide a simple, sensible, and sustainable solution to help you reach your health and fitness goals. First, get started with our easy-to-follow Vertical Diet ebook, which includes a quick start guide and sample menus to customize a diet plan that fits your goals. Second, use the My Vertical Tracker app to help you monitor and maintain your progress. And third, for our busy clients who are always on the go, let us do the cooking for you. Our Vertical Diet Meal Prep Company offers free shipping for your favorite meals delivered to your door in the US and Canada. So head on over to stanefferding.com and get started today.
All right, well, hello everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Vertical Diet Podcast. I'm Stan Efferding. I'm here with Damon McCune, registered dietitian, PhD exercise phys. I'm going to need him today because we've got a very special guest who's quite smart. I've watched much of his work and followed his, tried to follow his literature here ever since discovering him. And Damon, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest today?
Sure. So thanks for coming on, Ben. We really appreciate your time. So we've got Dr. Ben Bikman. He's a professor and scientist at Brigham Young University. He's got a PhD in bioenergetics, correct, Ben?
That's right. Yep.
All right, cool. I'll let you go ahead and give a little bit of your background yourself and kind of just explain to the audience kind of what you do and what your specialty is.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks, Damon. Stan, thanks for that warm and overly generous introduction. Some don't fall into the trap. Some people think that a PhD or even MD means you're smarter. All it means is you're really patient and you found something that you're willing to be patient with. That's all it is. So my background actually is very much like Damon's, I would bet. I got my undergraduate and master's degree in exercise physiology. Exercise science and exercise physiology, which is pretty much the same. It was more of the same in the case of the master's degree. I was really interested in how the muscle adapted to a stimulus like exercise. What was it that was occurring and stimulating this occurrence of a muscle, say, getting bigger or enhancing its oxidative capacity to work longer, better. But during the end of my master's degree, in the midst of all this focus on the muscle, I shifted and never imagined, but I became much more interested in the fat cell, actually, not the cell that was using the energy. Now it was the cell that was storing the energy. And this was because of the papers I just stumbled on looking at how the fat cells were actually endocrine organs. And that at the time, it just blew my mind. The idea that, I'd been taught that the classic endocrine organs, the only organs that are releasing hormones that will move in the blood to some distant tissue. That's an endocrine event. One thing in one part of the body releasing a protein that's going to a very different part of the body. That's an endocrine organ. And I was familiar with the pituitary glands, the hypothalamus, the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands. Those are kind of the stereotypical endocrine organs. But then learning that fat cells were in and of themselves endocrine organs. They were releasing proteins that were going throughout the body and having systemic effects. Like I said, that was mind-blowing to me. I was fascinated. And then what really hooked me was that this was implicated in being the key mediating event connecting obesity to type 2 diabetes, because everyone knew at the time that obesity is then causing type 2 diabetes. And indeed, that relationship is more nuanced than that, actually. But nevertheless, that was the beginning of my interest and my willingness to be patient sufficiently to get an advanced degree, because it's all about patience and learning how to play the game. But it was the birth of my focus on inflammation and insulin resistance. And then insulin resistance to this day is still the core of my kind of academic being. And then everything else that I do kind of just will come off that. My interest in dietary fat is because of my appreciation for insulin. My interest in ketones is because of my interest in insulin, because all of those things and so many more are in some way connected to insulin. And it's very gratifying for me, although it's a little unfortunate, but it's gratifying that insulin resistance is the single most common disorder, and we can get into that later.
Well, thanks, Ben. All of that is very exciting. I can't wait to get into this. I'm kind of anxious, really, because I've watched so much of your work and read a lot of your posts and many of your videos. I know, but it's exciting to me. Sometimes I can nerd out as far as I can, and Damon, informs me about the rest. But I kind of want to back up just a little bit, take that 30,000-foot view. You're up at BYU. We have a niece that graduated from BYU. We attended her graduation there a few years ago, and there's a large contingent of Polynesians, Samoans at the university up there in Salt Lake City, and a lot of them, we know were relatives. My wife's Samoan, born and raised in Western Samoa and American Samoa. And many years ago, I did a video where I talked about Brown University's research on the obesity epidemic in Samoa, and a lot of it related, of course, to diabetes. And so we have a pretty close connection. Her father passed from complications of diabetes a few years back, and that was tragic, of course, and that wasn't anything that they had ever experienced growing up. It was a very different time when they were growing and eating all their own foods before food stamps came in, and they started consuming a lot of seed oils and white flour and sugar. That tended to be the most affordable and most abundant resource for food on the island. So, and I think that's well known, but I wanted to step back here because we have probably over 100,000 now unique users of our vertical diet worldwide since we launched it, Damon and I. And it's a variety of people. I think people associate me with the athletes, the world-class athletes that I've worked with over the many years. But nowadays, the vast majority of our listeners are just dad bods and soccer moms, people with metabolic syndrome and have weight to lose and high blood pressure and cholesterol and things like that. And so I just wanted to slowly step into the things they can control before we start talking about all of the causes, the mechanisms of action that create these problems. And there's three big ones that I think that people can do, lifestyle, that I just want to kick this off so people know what can I do now, today, as soon as I'm done listening to this, and every day as part of my lifestyle. And I think a huge one is going to be improving their sleep. What can you say about how sleep affects insulin sensitivity and muscle loss as compared to fat loss with exercise?
Yeah, right. What a great question. We're really starting things off with a bang here. Without doubt, sleep is one of the most potent and unappreciated aspects of metabolic health, not to mention athletic recovery or anything else that you would know more about than me. One bad night of sleep can compromise insulin sensitivity by it will lower the body's sensitivity to insulin down to roughly, I think it's around 75 to 60%.
Wow.
So there's an immediate effect just from that very next day. And that's partly due to this very natural stress response. The body has sensed this lack of, I guess, recovery, or just what is a very real, normal, healthy, necessary physiological event, sleep. And the stress pathways in the body, and that those are mediated by hormones that very powerfully will antagonize insulin's effects. So things like the catecholamines, like epinephrine and cortisol, those are really the two key players when we talk about a stress response in the body. They're a little more amplified, and they will counter what insulin's trying to do. If we just look at it from the perspective of, say, blood sugar regulation, both epinephrine and cortisol are trying to push up blood glucose levels, whereas, of course, insulin's always trying to lower them. So there creates this sort of escalating war between these two sets of hormones, one trying to lower the blood glucose, one trying to increase. Even if that isn't their primary directive at the moment, it's nevertheless a consequence of them going to war. And so as the body has sensed this sleep deprivation, this is translated into some form of a stress response, if we can define that by increased stress hormones like cortisol and epinephrine, and that is antagonizing what insulin is trying to do. But if we look at it one deeper, if you will, and look at deeper intercellular signaling, even at the level of the muscle, or even the fat cell, actually, there is still a war being waging there, where cortisol is very catabolic at muscle cell. It does not want the muscle to be pulling in energy and building protein. It would antagonize recovery. Whereas insulin, especially overnight, is very facilitating with regards to recovery. It's stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So lest anyone ever accuse me of just blanketly stating that insulin is all around bad, Absolutely not. I'm not saying that, and never have. We want that potent mTOR activation, really, that insulin is uniquely qualified to do within the hormone realm, and cortisol does not want that to happen. So at the level of glucose regulation, metabolic effects with insulin, and then even muscle recovery, sleep deprivation is going to have an immediate effect. And if it's not corrected, it will continue to have lasting effects.
Well, people think I'm being motherly when I harp on this all the time, and it's not just about getting more sleep, but it's, as you mentioned, it's all those effects, and it has to be, infinitely more detrimental when you have something like sleep apnea.
Oh yeah, yeah, without a doubt. And in that case, you may be getting the right number of hours of sleep, but the sleep quality is so vastly compromised. I believe, I'm speculating a little bit here, or I'm trying to remember. So I'm speculating that with sleep apnea, the amount of time spent in deep sleep is dramatically compromised. They're basically always light sleeping and never getting deep sleep. And you really got to hit that deep sleep. I know when I'm tracking my own sleep, which I do, I'm more interested in the deep sleep than I am the total hours of sleep.
Yeah, that's very important. And also, just to keep banging on that drum, when somebody who hasn't gotten adequate sleep, either from burning the candle at both ends or getting up at 4 a.m. to do cardio after 5 hours of sleep, they're burning more muscle than fat.
Yeah, I don't know that. I would have to trust you, and I've not seen data and not looked into that too much. But if your insulin is elevated because of this, what's perceived as a stressful situation, and cortisol is elevated, cortisol will strip muscle of its protein in order to push the muscle, the amino acids to the liver to create glucose, and that is a situation no one wants. And if insulin is high, you cannot be burning fat. Your body is stuck in sugar burning mode. You're losing that metabolic flexibility. The body is a hybrid engine, metabolically speaking, and the two main fuels, there are actually more if we want to include ketones, but the main fuels are glucose and fats. And the body will flux between these two fat energy depots, and insulin is what controls that shift. If insulin's flipped on, the body's in sugar burning mode, and that means our fat cells are locked down. If insulin is low, the body is switched to fat burning mode, and now the fat is freely sharing its energy, its fats with the body, specifically the muscle, to be used very greedily.
Yeah. Well, I think the second thing on the list in terms of lifestyle behaviors that people can implement after sleep is going to be diet. And this one, of course, is going to start breaking off into a whole bunch of different directions. But generally speaking, when you've got somebody with metabolic syndrome, they've got a high BMI, a large waist circumference, and they've got some insulin resistance as a result. What is a reasonable amount of weight loss for them to start to realize some better insulin sensitivity and improvement in health markers, just generally speaking from the outside?
Now, should we address how to eat breakfast first, or what? Where do you want to go with that one? Because you brought up
I'm just thinking, generally speaking, the recommendation would be if you want to improve insulin sensitivity and you're overweight, obese, high BMI,
Yeah.
the general recommendation would be to initially you need to lose some weight. And that will impart significant benefits to metabolic syndrome. But people, but if you're 300 pounds, you don't need to be 180. How much weight? Yeah, go ahead.
You don't really need to even be losing substantial weight before your body is getting the message that, or before the metabolic health starts to improve. One of the most profound examples of this is when people undergo gastric bypass. This person could still be morbidly overweight, and yet they are immediately insulin sensitive in the wake of this process. And they start, of course, losing fat like gangbusters. Now, there is rightly so some conflict there. Is it because of the change in gut hormones that are like GLP-1 that is mediating some of this metabolic benefit? Probably. I would argue that the most profound effect is simply because they've started fasting. They don't have a choice. They've just stopped. They cannot eat the same amount they were eating before. They put their meal into one teeny little bunch of meals, one small little amount of food, and then they can't eat again for some period of time because their stomach is so small now. So the benefit, the metabolic benefits will start to happen, I argue, before a meaningful amount of weight is lost. And indeed, it's this improvement in the metabolic milieu that is enabling the fat loss. Most specifically, insulin has come down. And the moment the person just breaks from this habit of eating 6 starchy little meals per day, the sooner insulin can start to drop. And that is really the heart of so much of what I believe is our problem. That the person is told, oh, you got to eat breakfast and it's the most important meal. Well, yeah, no, it's not. It's just eat smart. Whatever you're going to eat, whenever you're going to eat it, especially in the person who has some hint of insulin resistance. And a paper published by UNC School of Public Health just a few months ago found that 88% of all U.S. adults are considered metabolically unfit, and they made that classification based on the person having one of the 5 main categories of the metabolic syndrome. So that's excessive waist, so enlarged waist circumference, high blood glucose, high triglycerides, low HDL, and high blood pressure. Those are the 5. Every one of those things is derivative of insulin resistance. And so to me, I see that number of 88% of U.S. adults being metabolically unfit. And I hear, maybe it's because I'm the guy with the hammer and I see the nail everywhere, and the nail's insulin resistance. But 88% of the adults in the U.S. are insulin resistant. I'm fairly comfortable and confident that that's the case. The best thing they can do, and this can lead into a conversation of what are the causes of insulin resistance if we want to go down that path, but the best thing they can do is lower their insulin. And the easiest way to do that, focus on the foods that don't spike insulin and be smart about the foods that do spike insulin.
Yeah, the simple answer I was looking for you gave right off the bat, and the reason for the question is to let people know that just within a matter of days, and certainly within weeks, that you don't have to go from 300 to 180. What most of the research that I've read suggests that even a 7% loss of total body mass is going to yield a significant benefit in terms of all of those markers. So a 300-pound person might only have to lose 20 pounds, which is not a huge hurdle to achieve a significant improvement in health and have good insulin sensitivity and potentially good long-term health outcomes. And you're suggesting that even in an immediate sense, within a matter of days, they can improve insulin sensitivity, which would therefore probably, impart health benefits just from, say, some time-restricted eating, as you mentioned, or like skipping breakfast, or just reducing the amount of carbohydrates that they consume. I'll have to make a distinction here that as this conversation progresses, we'll have to kind of look at things both from a metabolically compromised place where an individual has metabolic syndrome, is overweight, insulin resistance, et cetera, and then athletes who are healthy, metabolically sensitive. There's, of course, different recommendations for those people, but I don't want to go too deep.
But let's make that clear. I'm very glad you're mentioning this. Sometimes people will overinterpret what I'm saying, and I'm glad you're not, and I'm glad we're taking the time to clarify. I'm talking about the person who has a metabolic issue. For the average individual, I would just say be smart about the type of carb you're eating. You do not have to scrutinize it to the degree that someone with insulin resistance does. But the insulin-sensitive athlete especially, I heard an instance of an athlete who could eat up to over 200 grams of carbs per day and still be in ketosis. And man, that is a guy who is burning this glucose so well, his insulin is coming up and down so rapidly that he shifts right back into fat burning, which is necessary for a ketogenic state, of course.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm talking about the insulin resistant guy, not the athlete.
Yeah, I think
I'm going to hog the microphone for one more question just to finish off the dummy conversation for me and a lot of people out there who don't follow as deeply into these mechanisms of action. But we talked about sleep, the importance of sleep, the importance of either weight loss or just decreasing carbohydrates or meal frequency in order for insulin sensitivity. Those are things that people can do immediately today. The third one is, and a lot of the research that we've put out there just recently, I did another video, is just to increase movement, and we promote 3 10-minute walks a day, particularly after meals, for their benefit for insulin sensitivity. So that's a lifestyle change that's sustainable, that everyone can do today. 3 10-minute walks. How does that change the spike and the duration of glucose from the meals that you eat, just exercising immediately afterwards?
Yeah. So it can lower it by roughly half, and that's because
Wow.
the muscle has a mechanism to pull in glucose without the need of insulin. So normally, when insulin has come up because glucose has spiked. So let's flip this around. Glucose spikes, then insulin comes in to kind of save the day. Because if that glucose level stays too high in the blood for too long, it can create this non-ketotic coma, basically where if the glucose levels are staying above around 220 milligrams per deciliter, which not a lot of people are going to get to anyway, but if it got too high for too long, it starts spilling the glucose into the kidneys and then that into the urine, and that starts pulling the water from the blood, and our blood pressure goes too low. We can't keep the brain sufficiently perfused with blood because we need a lot of pressure to beat that blood up. And so the person faints, and in worst case scenario, goes into a coma or dies. So my point, that's a long-winded way of saying the body doesn't want glucose to be too high for too long. Insulin comes in, and it will start to push the glucose in a way, I'm not explaining this perfectly accurately, but for the sake of just ease, insulin opens the doors at the muscle cell, and then the muscle represents the greatest glucose sink. So the greatest site of just disposing glucose from the blood and pushing it into the cells or tissue of the body. Muscle, just by mass and metabolic rate, especially when the muscle's active, muscle is the greatest glucose consumer. Insulin does that. It mediates that process. However, because you don't want insulin to be high when you're exercising, you got to be mobilizing energy while you exercise, not storing it like insulin wants to. So you have to. The muscle has this clever. It's designed in this really clever way of being able to pull in glucose without the need for insulin. Essentially, there's a back door. Muscle contraction enables the same process that insulin would, and it allows the muscle to feed on all the glucose that it wants. So if someone is engaging in some physical activity after eating a meal, we have now provided a more rapid insulin independent method for glucose to clear the blood, and thus insulin can stay lower than it would have otherwise and still get the job done. The muscle contraction's helping.
Well, that's fantastic.
Exactly.
I just put out a video yesterday, a rant, where I talked about 10 ways that taking 10-minute walks after meals are beneficial, and you covered those in terms of the muscles absorbing the glucose without the need of extra insulin. So obviously your insulin levels won't have to come up as high for as long to manage that. And also the important thing about that is the frequency matters, that one 30-minute walk at the end of the day is not as effective as 3 10-minute walks after meals. And of course, we recommend everybody work out for muscle maintenance, but that again is still only 4 times, maybe 3 times a week for most people in terms of weightlifting. But that immediate walk after meals has been incredibly effective and shown to be twice as effective as even metformin for reducing the likelihood of getting insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. So I'll jump off here.
Metformin is the most widely prescribed anti-diabetic drug, and it still pales in comparison to lifestyle changes. Even the best drug can't beat lifestyle changes.
Man, I'm so glad you said that. So I'll let Damon dive in here. Sorry to take the microphone so long.
No, I think it's really important, like you talked about. It's important for the audience to understand that everything that we're talking about, like Ben said, is contextual, and that's kind of what we talked about with Paul Saladino a few weeks ago too. Is everybody's in a different situation, and so if you're a very high active, very athletic and metabolically healthy person, some of these things may not apply the same way to you as if you're somebody who's metabolically compromised. Your lifestyle might be different. It's going to be a case by case, and it's going to be a day by day for some people too.
Well, let's jump into some of your recommendations then, more specifically than those general ones. Here at the Vertical Diet, we say what's the best diet, the one you'll follow, and there's many paths to the same destination. And our goal is to find the path that works best for the individual. And you have a number of different methods that you utilize. In order to get people to improve their insulin sensitivity and to lose weight. One of the ones that you've talked about a lot is the intermittent fasting or the time-restricted feeding. Let's find out what benefits that has for people should they choose that path.
Yeah, so much of my conclusion over the years, as I've focused in more and more on insulin resistance, is the causal role of insulin itself. In other words, too much insulin drives insulin resistance, and this is a fundamental biological principle. Too much of anything will cause a resistance to that anything, whether we're talking about a drug that someone's consuming, whether we're talking about an antibiotic. It doesn't matter what. if a biological organism is exposed to something, it will chronically, it will attempt to reduce its sensitivity to that.
Including exercise.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the same stimulus will have diminishing returns, and so the person either has to consume more of whatever that substance was, they have to consume more or different aspect of exercise, if I can use the word consume there, and the body wants to. In the case of insulin, it's thinking these insulin pathways are on too much. In order to maintain some form of homeostasis, I just have to stop responding to all the insulin. So too much insulin causes insulin resistance, and thus the most rational conclusion is lower the insulin. Now, we know this is effective. That's why we have drugs that attempt to do this, like metformin will directly improve insulin sensitivity at tissues like the muscle. But we also have a bunch of drugs that attempt to lower the insulin by lowering the glucose. That's a smart strategy, but these drugs are pushing the glucose from the blood into the kidneys, so it's loading the urinary tract with glucose, and that of course feeds all the bacteria that everyone has in their urinary tract, and so UTI risk goes up. We have other drugs that will block the digestion of starches in our intestines. So you'll eat a piece of bread or whatever and take this starch digestion inhibitor, and now all that starch just stays in your guts. Well, sure, it now won't move into the blood, but now you got wicked diarrhea because you're pulling in all this water into your intestines. And so the person's now, they can't go out to social events because they don't ever know what's going to happen. You know, it's always a surprise for them, gastrointestinally speaking. But I look at that phenomenon and then I can't help but just say, well, if we're trying to push the glucose into the kidneys, if we're trying to block the glucose from coming in from the guts, why not just eat less glucose? It is not an essential molecule anyway. No, I'm not saying don't eat any, but let's just, for the person who has to lower their insulin, just eat less glucose. It is not an essential nutrient in humans. Focus on the two macronutrients that are essential, fats and proteins, and now you're going to create a pretty effective strategy. So that right there is kind of my best recommendation, or maybe simplest, most easily remembered, most palatable recommendation. It's sort of threefold. It's prioritize protein. I'm a huge advocate of someone ensuring they eat sufficient protein to maintain all function. Now, I don't even just mean muscle and bone mass. So ensure they get enough protein. So prioritize protein. Control carbohydrates. I'm not saying don't eat any, but make sure you're being smart about the quality of the carbohydrate and how much you're eating. And then fill the rest of those calories with fat. Don't be afraid of fat. Let fat fill those gaps in calories. Now, all of this, I submit, can be considered an aspect of fasting. So I like to break fasting up into two types of fasting. A caloric fast, which is when the person is truly not eating any calories or even drinking any calories. They're just drinking water or, club soda in my case, which I just have become addicted to as I gotten older. That's how I know I'm getting old, because I used to hate this stuff. And then in the next case, on the other hand, so the caloric fast and then what I like to call a nutritional fast. And I define this as a person eating food, so they're actually consuming calories, but these are calories that have a minimal effect, if perhaps no effect, on insulin. And minimal effect is protein, no effect is fat. And so if they're focusing on those two macronutrients, I contend that they're reaping much of the benefit, not all of the benefit, but much of the benefit of fasting, which is defined as a state where insulin is low. These early nutritional biochemistry, nutrient biochemistry professors would define a fed or a fasted state based on insulin. If insulin is high, the body is in a feeding state. It is storing energy. It is inhibiting autophagy. If insulin is low, the body is using energy. It's sharing the energy. It's not trying to conserve it. It's using it. It's sharing it to be used by the high metabolic rate organs like brain, kidney, heart, muscle, and so it's this mobilization of energy, again, that can only happen when insulin is low. So both of these states, caloric and nutritional fasts, enable that fasting state and activation of autophagy I didn't mention. But the nutritional fast is unique because you can't fast forever. You have to take in energy, especially if someone is very athletic and engaging in very frequent and intense exercise. The last thing you want is for your body to run out of its own energy, so run out of fat, which some athletes can do, that it has to start breaking down its muscle. in order to provide energy for the body. And that only will happen, someone will only typically be in a pronounced muscle burning mode, like actual chronic pathological muscle burning, when they've run out of fat. And of course, that doesn't happen very often here. But those are my two methods of sort of defining a fast: the caloric fast and the nutritional fast. What they share in common is that both have both are a low insulin state.
That's a really interesting explanation of everything, and that kind of leads into what would be your philosophy maybe on the time frame of these fasts, right? So everybody fasts at some point because we're sleeping, right? We just talked about how important that was. So everybody kind of intermittent fasts because they're not eating every 2 hours all day, every day. So what's your take on, like, what would be a reasonable, appropriate window?
Yeah, so that's a big question, and I'm a little reluctant to answer it just because I don't want someone to take my answer as any sort of gospel here. But I'll say what I'll say what I do. So what do I do with fasting? I have typically two full, like, genuine caloric fat 24-hour fasts per week. And in those instances, I'm drinking water, sometimes with electrolytes, depending on how I'm feeling. If I'm feeling a little sluggish, I'll make sure I have a little potassium chloride and sodium chloride, and maybe even a little magnesium glycinate on hand to just kind of tap into my water. And that will help me get through it. But usually they're pretty easy to get through. And so anyway, for me, it's two 24-hour fasts. Every other day is an 18-6. So it's a time-restricted eating where I rarely will eat breakfast. But I do sometimes, and I don't try to hold myself to some standard, partly because I am active. And if I've had a hard day the day before, if I had a really hard leg day, it always ends up being leg day if I ever eat breakfast. I will wake up and I will eat some eggs. And eggs are my go-to food, just for the sake of ease and quality of fat and protein. And
nature's multivitamin.
Yeah, right. Well said. Eggs, I consider this kind of a divine ratio, where there's this 1-to-1 by mass of protein to fat. And that's what you see typically in a steak, a 1-to-1 by mass, not by calorie number, because of course fat has more calorie than protein does. And I even hate counting protein as calorie. I don't think we should ever look at protein as a caloric source. I think it gives the wrong impression of protein being an energy. Protein is not an energy in all but the most extreme instances. Energy is carbohydrate and fat. Protein is building. So I don't like giving protein calorie number. I think it sort of creates a misunderstanding. But nevertheless, by mass, this mix of 1-to-1, I think there's something kind of divine there. And I think that we're smart if we base our strategy on that. Even with regards to muscle recovery, there was a really cool paper published looking at egg consumption. And they had some group of athletes, they actually looked at muscle protein synthesis that was eating just egg whites and in isocaloric, so same amount of calories. And the other group was eating egg white with the yolk, and so less overall egg white and more of the calorie coming from the yolk. And that group had a greater muscle protein synthesis, greater muscle recovery.
Yeah, I think I know about the study you're talking about. That was amazing.
So yeah, it is. It's fascinating.
The strength increase is what was most incredible.
The what?
I was pointing out the strength increase is what was most prominent in that study.
Yeah, good. So you know the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
And
I don't think we should overlook that. I think when someone's just focusing on, I got to get all my whey in this shake. I'm a fan of whey protein shakes. I really am. But there's a part of me that thinks, oh man, geez, where are you getting that fat, brother? You got to get some fat in there.
And the micronutrients.
Put in some egg. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which was the conclusion of the study, is that the more micronutrient dense protein source was probably the contributor. And that's why I've always said shakes are for fakes, eat steaks. And people misconstrue that as me saying that, shakes are you shouldn't have shakes, but I'm just saying you should prioritize the micronutrient dense foods.
Yeah, that's right. Or scrutinize the shake, and if you need to, make it a little better. Or if it's already coming in a 1-to-1, then in fact, forgive me for the plug. I'm part of a company where in the next few months we'll have that 1-to-1 ratio. So I hope I'm not looked at as being a shill here. I just sort of sense this gap where I didn't like people. Everyone's drinking those little protein boxed shakes from Costco, and they're pure protein, and I don't remember what they're called. I don't even want to mention them to give them any business. we're not meant to just eat protein. As much as I love protein, it's sort of as artificial as just eating pure fat, which is something in nature you just don't really get. Protein and fat come together, and I think there's a reason it does.
Yeah, you said something really interesting there about protein, how important it is. Jose Antonio's done a lot of protein overfeeding studies with the International Society of Sports Nutrition and shown that nutrient, as compared to overfeeding in carbohydrates and fats, does not lead to the weight gain that you might otherwise experience. So it's both beneficial because it's satiating and has a high thermic effect of food. And that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to touch on in terms of when someone trying to lose weight tries to pick the best path for them. And you mentioned intermittent fasting, you mentioned low carbohydrate. Both of those methods, along with the increased protein intake, all three of those methods, contribute to what is considered to be less hunger and ad libitum, a decrease in ad libitum food consumption. You just tend to eat less, not necessarily if you equate for calories, you might have similar outcomes, but if you just let people eat what they want to eat but maintain a time-restricted window, high protein, and a lower carbohydrate diet, they tend to eat less, which is a hugely important mechanism for compliance.
Oh, I totally agree. And as much as I sometimes get, I'm a little chagrined when people just want to focus exclusively on calorie number. I appreciate calories and the necessity of identifying where the energy is going from that calorie. But in this case of a person not feeling as hungry and thus the actual caloric consumption will go down, I think that is an absolute benefit of a diet that is time restricted and smart or controlling carbohydrates. What I would want to add to that is that the body, I said earlier, the body's a hybrid. It is, but we're also kind of like a big fuel tank a fuel truck rumbling down the road, a big rig hauling that massive tank of fuel in the back. That big truck has two fuel sources. It has that little tank underneath the cab. Well, it's massive by conventional automobile standards, but a small tank of fuel underneath the cab of the truck. Then it has that massive fuel tank that it's hauling. That truck has to stop and fill up. Just like a person who has to stop and fill up every 2 hours, it's because they're tapping the small fuel tank. They should be training the body, metabolically speaking, to tap the big one. That'd be like that truck driver being able to take the fuel lines to the engine and connect it to that big tank at the back. We want to tap into that big tank at the back so we don't have to stop and fill up every 2 hours. If a person is eating a meal and they're hungry 2 hours later, it's because they're tapping the small tank. They need to train their body to tap the big tank, and that happens, again, when insulin is low. We start to use fuel. So someone's going to go on, here in Utah, we have these beautiful mountains. Someone's going to go hike the Y as they climb up the Y mountain near campus here. They'll take a Gatorade. They'll take an energy bar. And I look at that and I just shake my head, not only because they're filled with sugar, but I look at my own fairly lean body and think, I've probably got 150,000 calories stored as energy just in my alone. I don't need an energy bar because my insulin's low. I'm going to tap into my own energy bars that I'm carrying on my body anyway. So why do I need this external energy? I'm going to teach my body to use my own energy. Basically, the person has to become fat adapted. They have to enable their body to almost, I would say, remember how to burn fat readily. And that only happens when insulin is low. So use the big tank, quit relying on that small tank that has to be topped up every so often.
No, I think that's huge. One of the things that you mentioned there was getting insulin down. Now, you said it's important to take in adequate protein, and some people think that protein intake, because it does spike insulin, will take them out of ketosis. I think people are fixated on this whole, I have to be in ketosis, I have to measure ketones, or I'm not going to be fat adapted. But protein has a much quicker turnaround and doesn't cause, it's an acute increase, but not a chronic increase. And so you don't suspect that people should decrease protein and take in extra fats.
That's right. I don't. Indeed, when I gave that talk about protein, it was because as I had made steps into this low-carb world, I was shocked at the number of people who were afraid of protein and thus afraid of real food like meat, what I consider some of the most nutritious food on the planet. And they were drinking. This one lady I talked to one time, she was drinking like 20 tablespoons of MCT oil every day. And I gagged when she told me that, but I thought that's a person who's gotten it wrong, unfortunately, where they have eliminated, they've stripped apart the protein from the fat, and that's not okay. Maybe in rare instances, the person can have a little coconut oil or something like that, or MCT oil, sure, but for that to now become even a remotely significant portion of the calories consumed in a day, I think is unfortunate. Protein does stimulate an insulin effect, or to be more accurate, we could say certain amino acids will stimulate an insulin response from the pancreas in the body. But we have to look at that in the context of what glucose is. And this has been studied. If a person has low glucose levels and is not eating glucose, the actual response of these amino acids of stimulating insulin is extremely modest. Very modest, and indeed it's matched by an equal or greater response of glucagon, which is sort of offsetting some of insulin's effects. However, if we take that dietary protein and put it in the context of high carbohydrate consumption or underlying hyperglycemia, so in other words, if the body has a lot of glucose in it, then protein can amplify the insulin response to that carbohydrate. So that would be something we'd want to be careful with. And indeed, I think there is evidence of this in nature. There aren't many foods, if any, really, that other than dairy. Dairy is high in all three macronutrients, and that makes sense because it's a food for growth. It's when mother is feeding baby, and we want that baby to grow. That's why dairy is high in all three, and it's meant to be. But if someone's done growing, then they might want to be careful with dairy, although I'm kind of agnostic about that. But in nature, I'm not aware of any really absorbable, high quality form of protein that comes with a lot of starch. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, and you've also said that you're not an anti-carb guy. You just you keep it reasonable and eat mostly fruits and vegetables as opposed to packaged foods that are high glycemic.
Especially if a person is insulin resistant. Another way to describe insulin resistance is glucose intolerance. They eat a comparable amount of glucose, 50 grams of glucose, and their blood glucose levels are spiked for hours, as opposed to someone who is very glucose tolerant. They eat that glucose level and insulin subsequently are just up and down within 90 minutes, 2 hours tops.
Let me ask you about testing. So people want to know, how do I know if I'm insulin resistant? And there's a number of different things you can test for. And let's see if we can set them up as leading indicators and lagging indicators, because there's lots of tests you can get on a blood test. You can get your fasted glucose, you can get your HA1C, you can get your insulin tested, your triglycerides. You can do the oral glucose tolerance test, and then there's, of course, whether or not you've got inflammation from C-reactive protein or homocysteine. So there's a lot of different things people can look at. How do we set those up so people know what's the most important number to manage?
Yeah. So what a great question. I would say the most important number, and you really touched on all of them. Really, if someone can get their fasting insulin, they want it to be below 6 microunits. 6 microunits. That's what I would consider a good number. However, most people that would be listening to this would say, all right, wait, I did just get a blood test. I'm going to flip through it and see. They won't have insulin there. That is very rarely measured. Often it's only measured if the patient has been begging care practitioner. More commonly, the person listening could go right to their blood test and look at two numbers, triglycerides and HDL cholesterol. Make a ratio out of those two. Triglycerides in the numerator, HDL cholesterol in the denominator. And if that number, triglycerides divided by HDL, is less than 1.5, it's a very strong indicator that they're insulin sensitive. And that's because of insulin's direct effects with both triglyceride metabolism, and HDL metabolism, which is partly related to how the insulin forces the liver to alter triglyceride metabolism. But I'll say it in a different way. If the triglyceride to HDL ratio is higher than 1.5, that's a red flag. The person is probably insulin resistant. But even simpler than that, if a person The skin can be used as a marker. If around the back of the neck or around the armpits, if someone has a kind of dark skin, this kind of dark, almost crackled skin, you can see the
Yep.
wrinkles in the skin. And that's a disorder called acanthosis nigricans. Or at those same spots, if someone has teeny little skin bumps called skin tags, those are absolute, almost certainty the person has insulin resistance. And then if the person doesn't have that, lest they think they're out of the woods, we can make it even simpler. If a person is overweight and has high blood pressure, it's extremely likely they're insulin resistant. Blood pressure is remarkably yoked to insulin levels. And that's one of the first things someone finds if someone adopts a diet that is sort of acknowledging that they don't handle carbohydrates very well, reduces eating frequency, and gets smart about their starches. Typically, I've seen it where people will be on blood pressure medications, antihypertensives. They have to drop those medications within about a week, within just days, because they start to feel so faint. Their blood pressure has dropped so much so quickly, they don't need the medication. Of course, I'm not telling someone to stop, but they'll need to be mindful of that development and speak with their doctor about it.
Yeah, we've seen that too. We have a high blood pressure quick fix kit that includes all of those recommendations, and sometimes people will present with some dizziness and lightheadedness because they're still on the medications while utilizing all those techniques. So you hit on some big ones. So if you don't have an insulin marker in your blood test from your doctor, look at your triglyceride to HDL ratio. That's almost always in there in your lipid panel. And that should be less than 1.5. It's important that you mentioned insulin less than 6 because that normal range goes all the way up to like 24.
Oh, in fact, I
it's
saw
ridiculous.
Someone just told me the other day how their insulin was 8. And he said, yeah, but 8's pretty good because the normal range is 4 to 38. And I thought it was striking that they had 4 as the limit. I know lots of really healthy people that are 3 microunits, and they're perfectly content. The body just doesn't need a lot of insulin. So that is one of the problems with insulin, because it has been so rarely scrutinized in a big way. There's really no consensus. I base my number on a study published from the University of Arizona that looked at women with insulin levels of 6 versus 8. And even within that, they could stratify this significant difference in developing type 2 diabetes later in life. So I have created that. I mean, that's kind of a consensus, the gospel according to Ben. But I justify it with those data. But I say 6 is the good number to be at or below.
Now, how about insulin? How about thyroid and its effect on insulin? Because I've seen the research where hypothyroid women as compared to normothyroid women might have 20-point difference in systolic blood pressure. And also how effective normalizing thyroid function is on actually reducing your lipids, your cholesterol levels. So does that also affect insulin as well?
Oh, it certainly does. And insulin, in contrast, will affect thyroid. I wish I could remember. There are data, and I'll have to speculate a bit here. So, and I confess, I might be getting this flipped, where someone was hypothyroid. They had like 5 times or something like that more insulin receptors on the fat cells. And what that would mean, and when they correct the hypothyroid, the insulin receptor number normalized, but that would mean these fat cells are potentially 5 times more sensitive to the fat cell growth promoting effects of insulin, because there's just so many more doors for insulin to come knock on. And when insulin comes knocking on a fat cell, it's telling the fat cell to grow. And it's telling it, don't share anything. We're just letting more people into the party and no one can leave. That's insulin's effect on the fat cell. So there is a very direct effect. So it almost makes the fat cells more sensitive to insulin because there's just so many more avenues or ways for insulin to do its job.
Yeah, and the question doesn't ask people to run out and get thyroid medication. It's just to say that if that is low, then optimizing sleep, decreasing body fat, can definitely help with thyroid function. Getting adequate iodine.
I almost hate to bring this up, but if one of the most common, if not the most common version of hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's as an autoimmune disease, the destruction of the thyroid gland is remarkably linked to diet, and in particular, and I almost hate to say this because I'm not a gluten fear mongerer, but people who have gluten sensitivities, a study found that they are, I think it was 20 times more likely to develop Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is a pretty profound number to see in humans, as kind of heterogeneous as we are, as mixed as we are. That's a remarkable phenomenon, but it's common across a lot of autoimmunities. If you're consuming something that's inducing an immune response, eventually the immune system forgets what it's supposed to be attacking and starts attacking self.
Yeah, and we're talking about blood tests here, and I think something that might be important for our audience too is that if you're wondering about your risk, you can also take your waist circumference, because that's really highly linked to insulin resistance as well. So, men and women, if you have a high waist circumference, I think it goes, some of the data I've seen, it goes as low as 35 inches in men and 30 inches in women. If you're above that, you could be
Yeah, and I need
your...
it. I'm too Canadian. I need that in centimeters. Is that about 100? Too much Canada in me still. I think, is that about 100 centimeters?
That would be...
No, let's just stick with inches. I'll play by Yankee rules here, and I'm thrilled to, of course.
That is 89 centimeters for men.
Okay.
And 76 centimeters for women.
Okay. So I bet the numbers I saw were probably 90 and 75 or something like that, just to kind of round it out a bit.
Well, and these are the low numbers I've seen, because I think it's really 38 inches and 35 inches, but the lowest I've seen is 35 and 30. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it matters. No doubt. If you're storing fat more centrally, it's very likely. Well, and you can take a different level to that too, because it is possible. I hope I don't regret saying this. Someone can be fat and be metabolically okay, and that typically means that's typically a result of their fat cells being still able to proliferate. So the fat cell starts to get big, and rather than get too big, it will say, I'm just going to make another fat cell, and a new one comes to life, and then another one, and another one. That's actually a healthy way of getting fat. And by that I mean, if the person has a lot of fat cell number, and that's typically manifests as a very loose, flabby, subcutaneous fat, it doesn't look good, maybe, but metabolically speaking, it's the better option. Their insulin will be good, their blood pressure will be good, their lipids will be good. They're just really overweight. In contrast, if the fat cell is forced to continue to grow just through size, so in other words, hypertrophic growth, rather than hyperplastic growth, where there's more and more of them. Hyperplasia is making more cells. Hypertrophy is increasing the size of the cell. If the fat cells are growing through hypertrophy, that's a bad way to get fat, and the person will be then fat and sick, which of course everyone wants to avoid.
I think the way we look at that is whether or not it's central adiposity, visceral fat around the organs, that kind of fat, which can happen like women who go through menopause. They tend to start storing fat differently. Rather than in the hips and butt, they'll start storing it in the gut area, and that impacts fatty liver, obviously, and kidney and everything else. So
yeah, and that's testament of the fat regulating effects of estrogen. Estrogen is a very fat-friendly hormone. Overall, it actually helps mitigate too much fat tissue. Progesterone really promotes more fat tissue in women more than estrogen, but estrogen also tells the body where to store fat. That's why little girl starts looking very differently from little boy as they grow into young adulthood.
well, and even the ratio of testosterone to estrogen in men, as testosterone lowers and the ratio becomes more equivalent, then they'll start to have that disparate storage problem. So we talked about a lot of the important things that people can do. The sleeping, obviously, the 10-minute walks, the lowering your weight, and some methods by which they could do that, lowering carbohydrates, possibly getting into ketosis, some intermittent fasting, and one of the major benefits of that might just be satiety, that you tend to eat less overall and not be as hungry. What are some other things that people can do? Talk me through in terms of the kind of nutrients they should get in their food. And like vitamin D, choline, inositol, B12, folate, all of those things affect the liver.
Yeah. So you're pulling me down a road where I'm enough of a micronutrient guy. I will say I like that you touched on some of the minerals, magnesium, zinc. Those are a couple that come to mind that I consider kind of underappreciated. But I can't speak with enough authority. I'm more of a macronutrient guy, you know, fats, proteins, carbs. Suffice it to say, micronutrients are essential. Vitamin D is a big one that there have been ample clinical studies done to show that improving vitamin D status in people with type 2 diabetes, which is just insulin resistance, helps tremendously. In fact, I just convinced my wife. She just started a vitamin D supplement, much to my delight. And I have been on, I take vitamin D as well. So yeah, micronutrients and vitamins, I'm not enough familiar with them to speak with any authority. I'd say they're important, and they play the part. They complement the macronutrients. In fact, we need the micronutrients to help the macronutrients be used in the body.
That's great. Well, we've taken up about an hour of Ben's time, and so I want to let Damon finish with the final question. We'll close out.
I guess I would say, you know, if you had someone come to you and they were maybe metabolically compromised, what would be maybe your number one thing that you would tell them? You know, they're like, hey, Ben, I really want to make a change. What would be the first thing you would say?
Yeah, I would say change breakfast. Start tomorrow. The moment they wake up, if they feel like they have to eat, focus on real food that is protein and fat. So, and I emphasize that because the body has, overnight, insulin has been allowed to start to settle down. And that has resulted in a shift, a fuel shift. And the metabolically inflexible person, which usually will go with insulin resistant, is a person that is stuck in sugar burning mode. Insulin's too high. It's not allowing the body to ever shift to fat burning mode. That shift is necessary, that metabolic flexibility to be metabolically healthy. So I would say start tomorrow, change breakfast, toss out the bagels, the cereal, whatever you want to focus on, whatever you normally focus on, and stick with a food, if any, that is protein and fat. And then you can, as insulin has come down overnight, you allow it to stay down longer. So that little bit of fat burning that's starting in the morning, you just fan that flame of fat burning, and it gets a little bigger throughout the day. And then when you do eat your first meal, if it's more kind of a balanced macronutrient meal, and that's fine, you're going to stop that fat burning, but at least you had that longer period of time to help improve metabolic flexibility.
Ben,
Awesome.
I think what you're doing over there is fantastic. Keep sending the message, keeping people focused on getting their blood sugars and insulin down. They're precursors to all of the major disease that we're familiar with, from Alzheimer's to heart disease to clogging of the arteries, of course, and cancer even. So, you know, anything and everything that you have been doing, continue to do. We really appreciate you getting the message out for people to focus on those insulin blood sugar numbers and try and get those down through whatever methods are most effective and most sustainable for them.
Yeah, thanks,
thank
guys.
you so much for your time.
I appreciate it. Stan, Damon, it was a lot of pleasure, my pleasure, a lot of fun. I just scratched the surface. If anyone, when it comes to insulin resistance, there is, I mean, I basically have a whole class on it that I teach here. If you'll allow me, anyone who wants to learn more, my book comes out in July, Why We Get Sick. Anywhere books are sold, go on to Amazon, find it, Why We Get Sick. It'll be a lot. It's a lot of insulin resistance and what to do about it.
And how can people find you on Instagram? Your posts are very informative and educational, and I read them often. So where do they find you?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so that's exclusively my hopes of sharing research. It's not me. It's not me and my family doing cute little things together. No. That's too personal. It's just research. So I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and it's just Ben Bikman, PhD, and Bikman is Bikman, no C. Ben Bikman, PhD.
Got it. Thank you so much for your time, Ben. Pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Hey guys, Stan Efferding here, founder of The Vertical Diet. We provide a simple, sensible, and sustainable solution to help you reach your health and fitness goals. First, get started with our easy-to-follow Vertical Diet ebook, which includes a quick start guide and sample menus to customize a diet plan that fits your goals. Second, use the My Vertical Tracker app to help you monitor and maintain your progress. And third, for our busy clients who are always on the go, let us do the cooking for you. Our Vertical Diet Meal Prep Company offers free shipping for your favorite meals delivered to your door in the US and Canada. So head on over to stanefferding.com and get started today.